Why do some steaks or roasts turn out perfectly tender while others turn out tough? Or maybe you're just wondering what the best way is to cook that piece of meat that you just bought. I'm Craig, the head butcher at Melvin Meats, and in this video, I want to help you learn how to pair the cooking technique to the piece of meat so that every time you cook your meat, you're using the right technique and getting the best possible results in your meal. We can group our cooking methods into two main broad categories. One is moist heat cooking and one is dry heat cooking. And generally speaking, for moist heat cooking methods such as braising or stewing, the tougher cuts of meat are the ones that use that method. The more tender cuts can use methods in the dry heat category, like roasting in an oven, or pan frying, or grilling, some direct or indirect high dry heat. The number one reason why you might end up with a tough result when you cook a piece of meat is that you haven't properly paired the cooking technique with the cut. The best way to know what cooking technique to use is actually to know the cut. Where did it come from on the animal? What are some of its attributes, such as the marbling of the fat content, the fat on the outside of the meat, the length of the muscle grains? All of these things come together to give us some idea of what the right cooking method would be for that piece. Some of the cuts off of a beef animal that are great for things like pan frying, grilling, broiling, roasting, these dry heat cooking methods are the naturally tender pieces. These would include New York strip steaks, filet mignon, ribeye, sirloin steaks, and maybe a few others. These are going to be naturally tender, one because of the marbling present in them in the case of a ribeye, for example, but also because of where they are on the animal. They're not the high use muscles that drive the locomotion of the animal as they're moving about the field. These are supportive muscles that just help keep the frame of the animal in place. So these muscles lend themselves to a fast, hot cooking. Regardless of the high heat cooking method you're using, whether it's on a grill over charcoal fire or propane fire, or it's on your stove in a cast iron skillet over high heat, it is important that you have a very high heat when you first put that meat into the pan or onto the grill, because you want to get a quick sear on the outside, get that nice crisp layer. The chemical reaction that creates the beautiful brown crispy tasty bits is the Maillard reaction, and that helps to actually enhance the flavors but also lock in some of the juices inside of the meat so that they're not just running out as you slowly cook over a moderate temperature. So start with a high heat. When you're using a hot cooking method on some of these desirable cuts like ribeyes or filet or New York strip, you don't need fancy seasonings. In fact, you're probably going to enjoy it more if it's high quality beef with just a little bit of salt and black pepper. Finally, when you take that meat off of the heat, once it's done, it's reached the internal temperature you're looking for, let the meat rest for 5 to 10 minutes. This is going to allow the juices internally to redistribute throughout the cut so that when you slice it, you're not allowing the juices to run out freely. Instead, they're going to stay in each of your bites. So when it comes to moist cooking methods, we can include braising, stewing, slow cooking, like in a crock pot, or even smoking in a smoker. The cuts that generally are going to be better suited for these cooking methods are those that have more connective tissue. They are the more heavily used muscles in an animal. So in a beef animal, this would include chuck roasts, short ribs, the brisket, and the bottom round are all good candidates for braising, stewing, or slow cooking in some form. Whether you're going to braise or stew or slow cook, it's still important to get that initial sear on the outside of the meat. You want to get some browning because that's going to enhance the flavors in the end product. If you just take a chuck roast and toss it into a pot with some liquid to braise it or stew it, you're going to fall flat compared to what you could enjoy if instead you put some hot fat in the pan, put the meat in that hot fat to brown the outside all the way before you go to a low and slow cooking method. And after you've browned your meat, you can add a liquid such as wine or broth or just water even, as long as you add enough seasoning. That piece of meat is going to essentially turn that water into broth as it cooks. And you don't need much. If you're braising, you just want a little bit of layer of liquid in the bottom. You don't want the meat totally covered. Now, if you're stewing, like in the case of maybe short ribs in a French onion soup, those short ribs are going to be fully submerged, and that's fine. That's a moist cooking method. In the slow cooker, it could be one or the other. If you're in a crock pot type of setting, maybe you have more like a braise with just a little bit of liquid, or in a smoker where you're smoking the meat low and slow, you may not have liquid around that meat directly at all, but you have a water pan inside the smoker that's keeping the humidity level really high. Now, there are some other beef cuts that can be cooked at higher temperature, but need to be cooked even faster than perhaps the ribeye, which has a lot of marbling in it. These are the leaner tender cuts. So this would include cuts like flank steak or skirt steak or the flat iron, where the muscle tends to be quite tender already, so it doesn't need to be slow cooked, but you need a very high heat, fast cooking to maintain that tenderness, because if you cook it too long, it'll actually turn out tough instead of maintaining its tenderness. In addition to cooking hot and fast for flank, skirt, or flat iron, these cuts are most important for you to know how to cut across the grain of the muscle. So for a flank steak or a skirt steak or the flat iron, it's quite obvious when you look at the meat, the muscle grains run in long stretches in one direction. And the temptation might be to actually cut with the grain. But what you would like to do so that you get to enjoy a tender piece of meat is that you cut across the grain. Butchers refer to this as mechanical tenderization. It's one of the ways you can get to a more tender piece of meat. And it's by using your knife to do some of the chewing for yourself. If you cut with the grain, you're now going to have a nice long grain muscle that you're going to have to chew a lot to actually break down. It's like the stringiness of beef jerky is what you're going to experience. Whereas if you cut across the grain, you've now shortened that piece of meat that needs to break down in your mouth, and so you get to enjoy a tender, flavorful piece of meat. The other tip that I'd recommend for these leaner tender cuts like flank, skirt, or flat iron is that you actually marinate them before cooking. Ribeyes, sirloins, fillets don't need the marinating. They're already tender and they're already full of flavor. But for a piece of meat that doesn't have a lot of marbling in it, and it's likely to be dry, but it is tender, you just need some pre-flavoring, and that's what a marinade helps you do. So just to pull together the three common mistakes that I'm suggesting you avoid. Number one, it's overcooking the tender cuts. Steaks such as ribeyes, fillets, New York strip steaks, sirloins, as well as flank, skirt, and flat irons don't need a long time in the heat. You might cook a 1-inch ribeye in just a few minutes if you're looking for a medium rare to medium cooking temperature. So it's very easy to end up overcooking. If you step away from the grill or the stove for just a minute too long, you may end up with a tougher product because you've actually overcooked to the point now that you're going to have a chewy steak. Number two, you want to be patient after you've cooked that meat and allow it to rest so that the juices can redistribute instead of running out onto your plate as soon as you make the first cut into the steak. And number three, kind of the big picture of this whole video, is that you want to match the cooking technique to the cut of meat. So it's very easy to end up with a tough steak if you used the wrong cooking technique or attempt to put a chuck roast onto the grill. Matching the cooking technique with the cut of meat is going to help you more consistently have a tender, juicy, delicious meal anytime you cook, whatever the meat is. So those two big categories: put dry heat cooking methods for the naturally tender cuts and maybe marinate ahead of time for those leaner cuts that may tend towards drying out, and then use moist cooking techniques for those tougher, more richly flavored, connective tissue filled cuts like the chuck roast and short ribs and so on. And don't forget to let your meat rest after you've cooked it, in the case of a dry heat cooking method, and slice it properly. This applies to either cooking method and whatever the cut is. Slicing across the grain is going to help you to tenderize the meat before you even put it into your mouth. So next time you're planning how to cook your piece of meat, try matching the technique to the cut for the best possible results. And if you're looking for high quality, hand butchered meats, check us out at melvinhillmeats.com. We can help you find the perfect meat and teach you how to cook it to perfection. Subscribe for more cooking tips like this.